Dzień dobry.
Good morning.
Mam nadzieję, że nie za głośno.
I hope I'm not too loud.
Bardzo mi miło.
It's a pleasure to be here in Łódź with you, and I want to thank the Dean, Professor 𝗏𝗏 𝐃𝐙 for the invitation. I'd like to address a topic that has interested me for a long time, specifically since the beginning of my studies at the National Conservatory in Paris, where I had the opportunity to work and deepen my knowledge in the field of impressionistic music and French composers. Today, I'll be focusing on Debussy's work. I'd like to talk a little bit about articulation and its influence on tone color. In the extensive literature dedicated to Debussy's piano works, positions directly related to the composer's exploration of sonority, which is a kind of essence or main focus of aesthetic interest, are particularly relevant to the practicing pianist. Sonority encompasses elements that shape the sonic image of a musical work, such as harmony, tempo, articulation, dynamics, and phrasing, of course. Of these factors, essentially, two have a decisive influence on the tonal color of Debussy's work. These are harmony and articulation, in combination with dynamics and the use of pedals. The specialist literature describing harmony in Debussy's work is quite rich, but I believe that the issue of articulation is somewhat superficially treated. I think the reason for this is that it's difficult to describe something so subjective, something that is subjective and subject to our judgment. And indeed, it's an individual process for each pianist. The starting point and material for my considerations will be Debussy's cycle of 24 preludes, which is like an encyclopedia of the composer's work. They gather all the characteristic features of his style, which appear not only in piano pieces but also in vocal and orchestral works. Historical and aesthetic conditions influenced the emergence of Impressionism as a completely new style, although it was certainly not its sole cause. From a musical point of view, late Romanticism had reached its peak. If we consider excessive emotionalism, subjective sentimentality, and complicated harmony, as seen in Wagner, we can say that there was a kind of stagnation in music to some extent.
W muzyce nastąpiła swoistego rodzaju stagnacja.
Debussy's innovative approach to tonal, color, and composition in general was not initially received with enthusiasm. Reviewers suggested a lack of clear form, melody, rhythmic disorder, and so on and so forth. Some even criticized him for a certain lack of distinctiveness in terms of the richness of color. One reviewer even wrote that his colors were barren. Only in the early 20th century can we observe appreciation for Debussy's work. The cycle of 24 preludes was created between 1910 and 1913. It is a significant testament to the composer's exploration of tone color. The sonic effects achieved by Debussy in this cycle are the result of innovative harmonic techniques, such as the elimination of tonal relationships between sounds, elimination of tonic or consonance as a tension-relieving element, the changing role of dissonance, parallelism, modalism, in this case pentatonic and whole tone scales, as well as the selection of harmonic characteristic use of articulation, dynamic actions, and specific pedaling, originally designed structure, pianistic figure structures, and the use of tonal differences between different registers of the piano. In the commentary to the edition of Debussy's preludes edited by Bolesław Wojtowicz, we can find the following division: preludes of a landscape character and dance preludes. I think we can, in accordance with 𝐷𝐺imirz Gejsztorn, expand this division and specify it a bit, dividing it as follows: landscapes, events in nature, fantasy world, musical portraits, genre scenes, and others, such as the third prelude, singular. Debussy's preludes actually lack a programmatic foundation. This is evidenced by the fact that at the end of the preludes, there are titles in parentheses, not at the beginning, but at the end, perhaps not to suggest anything deliberately. Articulation, as the encyclopedia states, determines the way sound is produced and shaped. It also shapes phrasing and gives the musical work the appropriate expression and complements it technically. The most important functions of articulation include the dividing and connecting function, rhythmic function, dynamic function, distinguishing function, and timbral function. In the case of Debussy's music, the last three are the most important from the performance point of view, although the rhythmic function, which gives articulation importance in the precise rhythmization of the text, is certainly not without significance. The dividing and connecting function may be more interesting to theorists than practitioners. The dynamic function occurs when the way sound is produced not only somewhat connects with dynamics, but also, and above all, influences it, such as the marcato or leggero technique. The distinguishing function occurs when at least two musical phenomena can be differentiated in terms of color by using appropriately variable articulation. In Debussy's compositions, this is a fairly common phenomenon. The timbral function can give the piano tones characteristics of other instruments or the human voice. This is, of course, not obligatory for the performer. Besides, Debussy provides such guidelines sporadically, but it may somehow motivate the pianist to search for tone colors. So, if articulation is a very important factor available to the composer in seeking to expand the range of tonal qualities in the work, then for every pianist, it is the most important factor. Even dynamics or the use of pedal in this context seem to be complementary elements, though equally important. After all, articulation is often closely related to dynamics in an inseparable way. Articulation provides the greatest practical possibilities for creating sound color. It also speaks to the technical predispositions of the performer, not to mention their artistic potential. It is therefore the most obvious and perceptible practical function. Assuming a completely hypothetical situation, where several pianists play the same piece exactly the same way, taking into account tempo, pulse, agogics, dynamics, and so on, we can say that the listener's feelings, precisely through articulation, will be completely different. And as Georgi Shandor writes, the direct cause of these differences is an extremely difficult to grasp indirect cause, which we observe somewhere between, as Shandor himself writes, in the movement between the hammer and the string of the instrument. In Debussy's preludes, the range of articulative means used is very rich. Often we encounter precise and suggestive graphic markings, however, they are not able to fully convey what the composer expected. Therefore, the main burden of achieving an execution close to the composer's concept rests on the performer and their musical imagination, musical awareness, intuition, and, of course, the knowledge they have on the subject. Apart from a few peculiarities, which I will discuss in a moment, Debussy uses commonly used graphic markings, which we can observe on this slide. Markings such as legatissimo, poco legato, staccatissimo have been replaced by descriptions related to the expressive interpretative sphere. Here I have divided them into two groups, typically separative graphic signs and typically dynamic ones. Now let's move on to these peculiarities of notation.
Widzimy tutaj
Here we can see
podwójną notację kreski
a double notation of line, bar line, and let's say arrows as accents. In this case, it's a clear indication from the composer regarding the rhythmic emphasis of the note lines with the help of the tenuto technique, as well as the dynamic accent, which results from the action of appropriate articulation. Double notation of a bar line and a dot may seem nonsense in the classical sense. However, in Debussy's music, it's analogous and suggests to the pianist the rhythmic emphasis of the notes, a kind of rhythmic sostenuto, without physically holding them with the finger. At the same time, staccato is performed more or less sharp, depending on the sound situation. A similar notation, although even more complicated, can be found in the first bar of Minstrels. It indicates an additional accent, articulated in a way that complements the entire sequence in terms of color. Similar color markings can also be found in fireworks, where Debussy indicates this accent with the word marqué.
Debussy oznacza słowem marqué.
In the next example, we can observe a kind of curiosity where Debussy uses 4 terms, 4 signs, to describe the character and sound of one note. Here we have a line, an arrow, along with sforzato and secco. We can certainly conclude that he wanted to achieve a dry, short, and at the same time strong sound here. I think we can use the term new articulation to describe this articulation, thereby attempting to characterize it in terms of its coloristic possibilities and practical use in the texture of the preludes. I will use terms related to individual notes and more abundant structures, focusing on various elements of the coloristic base of the cycle. And here we have the division. Touch, vibrato, purse, imitation of other instruments, verbal descriptions, chord articulation, octave or chord leadings, articulation, interchangeability, multi-plane articulation structures, variable external articulation, chord swelling, silent articulation, articulation of glissando elements, staccato with pedal. When it comes to toucher, it's a French term directly referring to the way sound is produced from the piano keys with a characteristic touch. This term gained significance in the era of Impressionists, although it could have been used much earlier, such as in performing Mozart's works. It describes the entirety of articulatory operations within a performed piece. Primarily, it pertains to the sound solutions in the artist's imagination and creative consciousness, which can later determine appropriate technical actions. Marguerite Long's words about Debussy's playing illustrate this. It is impossible to forget the agility, softness, and depth of his touch. At the same time, as he slid with compelling delicacy across the keys, he acted upon them in such a way that he obtained accents of extraordinary expressive power. He always played piano, but with a full and intense sound, without any hardness in the strike. Therefore, we can consider the characteristics of toucher to be agility, softness, delicate and precise key touches, flexibility, specific articulation of expressive accents, and the contact of the entire mechanism with the keyboard. The next point is vibrato, which is a characteristic feature of Debussy's sound. It's closely related to articulation, although due to the significantly less responsiveness of the piano compared to, for example, string instruments or the clavichord, where vibrato can be applied immediately after depressing the key. There we have direct control over the sound source. It is not as effective, practically unattainable on the modern instrument. Vibrato is somewhat related to the intensity of the sound.
Vibrato jest w jakimś stopniu związane z takim czy innym natężeniem dźwięku.
However, the main mechanism of this operation lies in the appropriate balance of proportions. It is impossible to precisely describe how to achieve this effect. It is an individual matter and the consequence of many atoms that absorb our musical consciousness and sound imagination. We can observe such a tension from Debussy here at the bottom, which translates literally to allowing the strings to vibrate. The next point is 𝐃𝐙 or 𝗏𝗏 playing. I think we can relatively easily characterize it as bright and light playing. We have encountered such texture much earlier, with Ferenc Liszt being a pioneer in this field in 𝗏𝗏. Generally, it boils down to playing leggero. With Debussy, this type of articulation is additionally reinforced by terms like extrêmement léger et 𝐾𝐙, articulatory effects imitating other instruments. Oh yeah. Here we can observe 𝗃𝗏 in fireworks. Articulatory effects imitating other instruments. One of the most intriguing features of Debussy's piano music is its rich color palette and orchestration. It is based on the imagination of the pianist and his or her performing abilities, leading to a strong chromatic diversity in the various layers of the musical image, without disrupting the logical structure or fluidity of the musical narrative. In the preludes, we can notice a unique selection of layers for individual voices and points, subtly suggesting the type of instruments used by their natural color. There are few specific indications regarding orchestral instruments in the text, but a few examples can be found in 3 pieces of the cycle. In Sounds and Fragrances, where it's written in translation like distant horn sounds, in the Interrupted Serenade, quasi-guitar, and in Minstrels, quasi-snare drum. Of course, recognizing the sound of individual orchestral instruments in the preludes is purely subjective and should not be treated as obligatory. Professor Wojtowicz' commentary on Debussy's preludes can be very helpful in this regard. Of course, this should be taken as a delicate suggestion, perhaps stimulating imagination a little. When it comes to verbal descriptions, we can divide them into 2 groups. The first group requires no special comment, only that 𝗏 may raise some doubts, as it is an articulation similar to that on string instruments. It is certainly separable, quasi-non-legato without excessive lightness. The execution and selection of articulatory means for terms from the second group, here divided into 3 slides, is a subjective matter. But these are such accurate guidelines that the margin of error is practically small. Regarding chord articulation, we can distinguish 2 types of chords in Debussy's works. Those in which one of the components is slightly emphasized, and those in which all components are equally important in terms of sound. We have been dealing with the first type for a long time, since the dynamic keyboard came into use. Typically involves creating a chord with an exposed soprano. In Debussy's preludes, such situations also occur very often, but we also encounter situations where the soprano is not as prominent, and the chord sounds fuller and warmer. There are also passages where other components are more important. The second type of chords, however, is entirely novel in Debussy's works, where all components should be played evenly, without a melodic line, as in the prelude, the Weingate. This creates a kind of uniform chromatic background.
Prowadzenie oktaw i akordów.
Leading octaves and chords. Actually, a point related to the previous one. When leading chords and octaves, the same principle applies, regulating the way most single chords are articulated. A slightly brighter soprano for emphasis, with the remaining components darker and equally resonant. Exceptions, however, also pertain to the color scheme, such as those passages where the right hand material is doubled by the left hand and where the melody is carried out by the lower voice, or, which is also a novelty, led simultaneously by the highest and lowest notes of the passage, creating a double line of extraordinary color. Here we can observe the variability of articulation. It is its variation within short segments, sometimes realized by a single melodic line, as here in the tenor line. Its expressive and chromatic contents are visible in many preludes, especially those with a capricious character, just like here. A typical example of the variation of the articulatory line, where it directly influences the peculiar course of the narrative and the color agitation of the sound texture. The special juxtaposition of two articulations, completely different in terms of color. Sometimes variable articulation concerns similar passages in terms of line leading, voice leading. Each time it provides a different content of expression. Multiplicity of articulatory structures refers to the combination of at least two horizontal articulatory sequences, resulting in strong differentiation, both vertically and horizontally. This further enriches the sound in many pieces of this cycle. It seems to me that, in this respect, the second volume of the preludes is more complex and diverse. For example, introducing a third system of notation as a rule for each piece in this collection provides an additional opportunity to intensify the coloristic effects and, importantly, achieve excellent selection of layers. The expressive function of each layer is a different thing in such a situation. However, after synchronization, the whole becomes complete and logical. These are very convincing examples providing evidence of Debussy's vertically and polychromatically complex articulatory structures. In this excerpt, we see three layers, with the high soprano somewhat reminiscent of an earlier scene, and the other two with the help of various articulatory means, forming the background. Variable articulation. Clarifying this formula, I will add that it refers to a single group of notes gathered under one slur, constituting a formally indivisible structure. Executing such a motive uniformly would certainly contradict Debussy's idea of subtle but expressive color changes. The composer's indications regarding the change of motive color are incomplete in this case, but he did not have the means to graphically resolve the issue. Therefore, he only used a sign indicating a change in sound intensity. Such a coloristic solution is possible through a lighter and more selective articulation. On dehors, or outwardly. In essence, this formulation is quite concise in Debussy's works. It applies to both individual notes and most groups important for achieving the appropriate sound atmosphere. From a technical point of view, on dehors primarily concerns articulation, but dynamics also play a role in this process of sound extraction. It could be said that the equivalent of this term is marqué or marcato. Building up chords. The situation in Debussy's works is sporadic, very interesting, but difficult to execute. As I mentioned earlier, the piano's responsiveness to such actions is practically zero. Therefore, realizing this phenomenon mainly involves a psychological impact on the listener. In Debussy's preludes, you can find several suggestions relating to such a phenomenon. They are conveyed using the graphic symbol of crescendo. Mute articulation. This refers to the re-seizing of sounds or chords where they are bound. It is not something new in piano texture, but in combination with other elements, it often creates a unique sound atmosphere. The last two bars of the prelude mists, seizing with the left hand the same chord again to achieve better layer selection and text clarity. Such a situation can also be heard and observed today during the concert, especially in the second piece of the first volume, Hommage to Rameau, in the last bars, in the last two systems, actually. I also invite you to today's concert. Legato articulation with glissando elements. In the preludes, we can find passages where the effect of playing legatissimo can be supported by the action of other parts of the mechanism, including the whole hand, wrist, and forearm. Combining this characteristic glissando action with finger manipulation allows for achieving the sound suggested by the composer. Here, it can be said that there was a quote from Bolesław Wojtowicz, who sometimes even very literally writes in the commentary how to play certain passages. Here you should raise the elbow or not raise it, etc. Of course, this can be useful in the pianist search, but as I mentioned earlier regarding instrumentation, it is not obligatory. And the last point I would like to mention is staccato with pedal. Traditional rules regarding the execution of a series of notes marked with a dot and as staccato precisely define the way they are articulated. The use of the pedal can change the sound of individual notes of such character and sometimes also combine them into larger groups to achieve a more expressive coloristic effect within one harmony. In Debussy's works, there are quite a few examples of this phenomenon where staccato-played notes appear using the piano's right pedal, often in combination with a harmonically dissonant background. This gives us the effect of coloristic mixtures, perhaps serving as a prototype for later, especially characteristic of the second half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, clusters.
Klasterów. Serdecznie dziękuję.
Thank you very much.